Good morning, River Rocks. I'm Patrick, and I'll be leading today's devotional. So today we're going to be finishing out Mark chapter 6 with the story of Jesus healing the multitudes of sick people. But before we get into that section, let's do a brief overview of Mark chapter 6 that we've covered. So if you remember, at the beginning of chapter 6, we saw that Jesus was rejected when he first preached in the city of Nazareth, which was his home city. So even though a lot of people there were astonished by his teachings in the synagogue and even witnessed him healing a few sick people, Jesus knew that Nazareth was still a place of great unbelief. But that worked out because that gave him and his disciples the chance to preach in the surrounding areas and to begin their ministries. And then later we saw, though, that John the Baptist was executed by King Herod for calling him out because John the Baptist had called out King Herod for his sin of adultery. So this would be a great blow to the disciples at the time, but thanks to Jesus' leadership and their faith in him, they knew their work wasn't finished yet, so they continued onward with Jesus. And then Jesus brought them before the crowd of 5,000 people and miraculously fed them all. And this was important for the disciples because at that time their hearts before this moment were still too hardened to see God work through all circumstances. But thanks to Jesus' devotion to the Father, they witnessed this miracle and learned why they should only rely on God. And then we saw Jesus walking on water, demonstrating his power over the laws of nature itself and affirming his divinity. So while the disciples were in the boat afraid of what they were seeing with Jesus, the Lord had no fear because he had the power of the Father within him. And with that, the disciples knew that they too had no reason to fear, so long as they had complete faith in God alone. Now, in this next story here, starting in verse 53 of chapter 6, we're going to see the Lord bringing his attention and power to the multitudes of people, all to bring them closer to him, the Son, and to God the Father. So we'll start there in chapter 6, verses 53 to 55. So here it says, "When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and anchored there. And when they came out of the boats, immediately the people recognized him, ran through that whole surrounding region, and began to carry about the beds those who were sick to wherever they heard he was." So what we see here is that Jesus and his disciples land in Gennesaret. So this was a town right by the Sea of Galilee that was between Capernaum, which was the city Jesus had chosen as his home city after being driven out of Nazareth, his native city, and the region of Magdala. And this is where, of course, Mary Magdalene would come from. An interesting thing about Gennesaret is the famous Jewish historian Flavius Josephus would describe this area as having a lot of rich soil. Now, in this story, we see that Jesus picked this region because there would be a lot of spiritual soil for him to do his mighty work. Now, when he and his disciples arrived, there was already a massive crowd of people rushing towards Jesus for him to heal them. Now, for the disciples, it must have been daunting for them to deal with all these people all at once, trying to get to Jesus to have him heal them. But as Jesus showed with him walking on water, they had no reason to fear because Jesus was and always is in control. Now, part of the reason why the disciples did not need to be afraid here was because despite this being a massive crowd of people, this wasn't a mob of people ready to attack them. Now, for the disciples, they may have had to have dealt with hostile people a lot. But in this situation, all of these people were running straight towards Jesus, ready to be healed of their afflictions. Now, this is how we need to be when we seek the Lord in our lives. Like this crowd, we all have our own personal afflictions that we have to deal with. And while these afflictions can be health-related, in a physical sense, oftentimes our afflictions can be things like can be deeper things like family troubles, work-related stress, and even life-dominating sins. But oftentimes we don't recognize these as afflictions that need to be healed immediately by the Lord. Oftentimes these will just be problems that we have to deal with on our own. It's just my family, it's just work, it's just a little sin that I'm dealing with. I can deal with it myself. But we should see this crowd approaching Jesus as an example for ourselves to do the same. So if we ever find ourselves dealing with any kind of trouble, physical or otherwise, we should approach the Lord without any fear and without any hesitation. Now, let's look here in verse 56 to see what the Lord has in store for all these people approaching him. So in verse 56, it says, "Wherever he entered, into villages, cities, or the country, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might just touch the hem of his garment. And as many as touched him were made well." So, as these sick people laid their troubles before Jesus, he let them touch his garments, and immediately they were healed. So the garment here is very important, especially with Jewish culture at that time, because the Israelites were given a specific commandment in Numbers 15:38, where it says, "Tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a blue thread in the tassels of their corners." So what we see here with the people touching the garment of Jesus, this helps establish a scriptural connection between Jesus and the very people he was promised and sent to save. So what we see here in this example is the Lord wants to heal us, and once we approach him, his healing is immediate. So what we can learn from all of this, not just from this story, but from all of chapter 6, is the work of Jesus Christ always comes full circle. So our Lord began Mark chapter 6 with being rejected in his own native country of Nazareth to being embraced full-heartedly in an entirely new country by those in desperate need of his healing, physical and spiritual. So no matter what affliction you're dealing with today, run straight to the Lord and touch his garment. I promise you, if you run toward him without any fear or hesitation, he is already there, ready to heal you instantly. So, thanks so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day, and God bless.